We are back on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. Joining us once again, and I always look forward to our conversations, is Professor Richard Wolff. As you know by now, if you're a regular listener to the show, Richard Wolff, or not for that matter, Richard Wolff is an economist, economic historian. He's the host of Economic Update on Free Speech TV. He's a professor a bunch of places. I don't want to list them all because I want to get to talking to him. His latest book is The Sickness is the System, about the COVID crisis. And he joins us once again. So first of all, Richard Wolff, welcome back on the program.
Thank you very much, RJ. I'm very, very happy to be here.
Sorry to give short shrift to your professorships there. So, if I were to give a title to the subject that's on my mind, it might be Great Britain, what the hell? Because it is, astonishing to watch this disintegration. I lived in Great Britain in the 1970s, early 1970s as a student. And, it had its problems, but it was appeared to be a functional social democracy. It had, I had full medical coverage as anyone there did. Didn't have to worry about that. It had at that point a Labour government, and the Labour Party of Great Britain at that time still had some vestiges of socialist thinking in it. It struck me. And it seemed to be on the upswing, even though it had just jettisoned most of its or all of its empire, and they'd had a very tough battering during the war, and in the 50s, tough recovery. They seemed to be doing okay, pulling themselves together. Now it just seems like chaos, one thing after another, to the point of seeming ungovernable. What's your take on what's going on there?
Well, I think I agree with you. I think that's a good summary of how drastic their recent years or decades of decline have been. I think the way I would go at it is to start from the loftiest vantage point and then work down to the last few weeks. Britain was one of the great empires the world has ever seen, a remarkable tribute to capitalism, because it was capitalism that gave Britain the chance to become a global empire. And as I'll try to argue, when capitalism left Britain, when the dynamic center of capitalism left Europe and went east effectively, it is on its way to becoming again what it was before capitalism arrived, namely a rather cold, rather wet, small offshore island off the mainland of Europe. And it has no one to blame for this up and down ride but itself and its own engagement as a society, as a culture with capitalism. When it first made the engagement, it became the leader in new technologies and new lines of production, shipping, which of course for an island is absolutely crucial, metalworking, cotton textiles, all the things that in the 17th, 18th, and into the 19th century made for successful capitalist business. And it did it. And it went around the world as it expanded from England to the British Isles and then there was no limit. So it would get cotton from slaves in the American South and produce clothing that it sold everywhere in Europe. It produced textiles with which they basically destroyed the textile industry of India, which had become a colony of theirs, so that they were in a position to do all of that. The world was their oyster. The world provided the food, the clothing, the raw materials that the British could then work up into final goods, pay as little as possible, to the colonial territories that produced the inputs, charge as much as they wanted because they were the only game in town, and making a fortune that then built the palaces and all the rest of it that we watched a few weeks ago when Queen Elizabeth died. And her dying, was so laden with symbols because, after all, it was by then a frail elderly woman, and yet she was carried to her burial place in resplendent gold and diamonds, which come from this capitalist period of an
Right.
empire. And I think, you don't have to be a poet to see the poetic message in here that what goes up comes down, that the empires of the world have, as many poems attest, nothing but the wind that blows through the ruins that are left. And why is that important? Because for us here in the United States, we are now arguably in the down phase of the American empire, the empire that replaced the British, that had a lot to do with depriving Britain of its dominant position because the ex colony, who fought a revolution to become independent, used its independence to outgrow, to outmaneuver, and to out internationalize what the British had accomplished. Extraordinary. And so the question for the United States seems to me, are you going to learn from what happened to the British? Or are you going to be condemned to repeat what happened to the British? In other words, take a long, hard look, because there are lessons there. And if you learn them, it'll save you. And if you don't, well, then it won't. Let me give one example, because I think
Sure.
that gets the point home. As the United States, as a community, made the determination towards the end of the 18th century that their economic well-being required them no longer to be under the control of the British king, George III, at that point. They made the decision to break away. And the king told them they can't do that. They belong to the kingdom, and therefore, et cetera, et cetera. Tea Party in Boston, most of us know at least the sexy parts of the history. And a war was fought, and the British lost the war. And in 1812, which was only a few decades later, the British tried again to fight a war with the United States, and they lost again. In other words, twice they resorted not just to military and financial pressures. We might call them the forerunners of today's, I don't know, sanctions might be a word that comes to mind. They resorted to military force when the sanctions didn't work, and they were roundly defeated. And the British then made the determination, if you can't beat them, join them. And the British changed their policy, and there was lots of debate in England about it. For those who don't know, there was a lively debate in Britain during the time of the American Civil War whether the British should side with the North or the South. Was not a simple decision. It was not unanimous or anything like it. And that had to do with leftover bitternesses of the relationships here. Okay. In the end, though, peace was the way they worked it out. Britain and the United States eventually became allies, not wartime adversaries, allies. And I think both of them would argue they were better off as an alliance than they were when they were killing each other. Well, the obvious implication, I would argue, is how we are dealing with what's replacing the American empire, which is, however you want to put it, the Chinese empire. What are you going to do? Well, you can try war. Right now, the United States is at war with China's number one ally, Russia, in Ukraine. Right now, the United States is throwing every kind of financial sanction it can think of against both Russia in a whole host of ways and against China in a whole host of ways. In other words, you might describe the US and China as in that early phase, reminiscent of Britain and its colony slash ex colony here in the United States. So for me, the question is, will the lesson be learned, or are we headed down the road of one war after another, where, by the way, the likely two outcomes, either a rerun of what happened with Britain and the United States, or the nuclear catastrophe that we hear about so much these days?
Well, if we go back to, and thank you for that, but if we go back to, let's say, first half of the 20th century, sticking with Britain for a second as a model, at the start of the 20th century, of course, they didn't have the United States, hadn't had the United States for well over 100 years, but had, and they were still saying the sun never sets on the British Empire, right? There were possessions all around the globe. At some point, I mean, we could go into, World War One and what that did to their finances and so on. I'm not sure we need to go that deeply, but at some point, it seems between, let's say, the 1920s and World War II, that there was a realization of some kind that this empire was no longer sustainable, that plans began to, and I'm sure you know the history far better than I, but my sense is then plans began to be drawn up, throughout the 30s and so on. They were rebelling in India, but Ireland got most of Ireland got its independence in 1921 and so on. India in the late 40s. There was a sense that, my sense is that there was a sense that the judicious thing to do is to realize we can't sustain this empire. Let's reorient ourselves along different lines. Is that accurate, my perception?
Yes, I think so. I think that you don't have to really choose. World War One turned out to be wonderful for the United States and horrible for the two other contenders at that time for global dominance in the capitalist world, which were Britain and Germany. Basically, Britain and Germany destroyed one another. The United States, mostly a spectator to that process. I mean, he participated, it was allied with Britain for sure, but nonetheless, nothing comparable happened. The United States was in a position to lend Britain all that money that the British had to then repay at the end of the war. The way the British did it was to take advantage of the fact that they had defeated the Germans to impose reparations. What that
Right.
did was to wreck the German economy. So it was forever wrecked and led to social dislocations inside Germany that should make anyone who thinks about the word sanction
Mm-hmm.
worry a lot about what are the so-called unintended or unanticipated consequences of doing that to another nation,
Which in
given
this
what we
case,
do.
excuse me for interrupting, but which in this case includes, I would assume, the rise of Adolf Hitler.
Absolutely. There is no explanation for Hitler that doesn't take into account that the Germans lost World War One, that was followed 5 years later in 1923 with the world's worst modern inflation. I mean, people think we have an inflation now. Prices were doubling every couple of hours in Germany over months. The entire savings of the entire German middle class were wiped out in a matter of weeks. They were worth a pound of butter, whereas they had been accumulated over 3 generations of grandmothers and grandfathers putting
Mm.
away a little bit for their family. And when that was done in 1923, roughly when the inflation hit, that gave them another 3 or 4 years before they were whacked in the face with the Great Depression. I mean, you subjected the Germans, who thought they were the inheritors of the British Empire, the
Hmm.
declining British Empire, we would take over. They went from the euphoria of such a self-image to the decimation of a lost war, the worst inflation imaginable, and now the worst catastrophic depression capitalism had ever encountered in itself before. And yeah, they became a crazed people. They did very strange things. One of them being elevating this small mustache clown to the position where his wildest fantasies could become policy that the rest of the world had to respond to. And we ought to wonder. We have been attacking the American working and middle classes for 40 years. We have redistributed income sharply away from a middle class, which is virtually gone now, and from the poor, who didn't have much in the beginning. At the end of 30 to 40 years of redistribution, squeezing them every year, what do we get? We get a crash in 2020, second worst in the history of capitalism after only the Great Depression of the 30s, the COVID public health disaster to which our response is itself a disaster, then an inflation now, and now raising interest rates. It's too much. You cannot impose on a working class such a series of economic crashes when they were expecting what in this country the so-called American dream was supposed to be dished out to everybody who goes to school, works hard, and keeps their nose to the famous grindstone, etc., etc. You're not. You're destroying everything, their future, their children. And do they get crazy? Well, let's see. Do they rediscover white supremacy? Yeah. Do they put into office a Donald Trump? Even by America's low bar, that's pretty low to vote that kind of thing in. Are they doing that? Yeah, all over. Tommy Tuberville, Herschel Walker. I mean, I could go on. What is going on here? What kinds of crazed upsets of otherwise perfectly normal people are we seeing? And shouldn't we wonder about that? The British, let's go back to them here briefly. They have been on a decline now for a long time. One would think that they are beginning to have to face the fact that the capitalism that built them up is now tearing them down. Why then vote for the conservative party all these years that represents nothing but the denial ridden notion that this capitalism is going to be great? It hasn't been great for you for a very long time. You're going down, down, down at every turn. Well, it's modern society. And in modern society, the people who sit at the top understand that one of the key things they need to do to stay there is to distract the population from the realities around them, refocus them somewhere else, convince the British people in the run up to 2016 that the cause of their empire's decline and their capitalism's decline and the departure of their industries for places in the rest of the world, like China, where they can make much more profits than they ever could in England in recent decades, pretend all of that is Europe's fault. Develop an entire campaign in which
Right.
we vote to break from. I mean, it's as if we all got together and said the magic words, Kaloo Baloo, and then we will get a magical recovery. Of course, you got nothing. The Brexit is here, gone. The British economy in worse shape than ever. It's just, you begin to wonder what what will it take to shake modern populations of capitalism out of the delusional commitments they have to sets of ideas about capitalism's marvelous functioning that were never true, that could be entertained when you were doing well, when it was your moment historically to be on the rise, but that are exposed for their factual errors for their theoretical non sequiturs on the way down. So it becomes harder and harder for the defenders of this system to make an argument. And I admit, I don't say that with altogether sympathy, since the difficulties of people with arguments to defend capitalism makes my life as a critic a lot more pleasant.
Well, it certainly should make it easier. Whether it does or not, I don't know. I have thoughts. Would you like to hear them?
Yes, please.
Because thought number one, we should have, we meaning the world, not just the United States, we had empirical evidence of the failure of the system in 2008. And yet we didn't grasp that. We had empirical evidence in 2020, and yet we didn't grasp that. And thank you for that history and that overview. But I do feel, in terms of Britain and the United States as well, there's another element that is critically important to all of this, which is, for example, in Great Britain, you had in 2015, 2017, an upsurge of excitement led or personified by Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy's been on this program, lovely man, very well intentioned. I'm sure you've spoken with him. And we saw a shocking campaign of press vilification, where this man who's fought all his life for human rights, for rights of every kind of human being, accused of systematic anti-Semitism and everything else. And we saw members of his own party, the Labour Party, veterans of the centrist so-called Tony Blair, Bill Clinton wing of the Labour Party, just undercut and sabotage this guy at every turn. So I would, in that sense, give the British people a little bit of a pass. They started to flirt with a real change in their country's direction, but they never got a chance to hear what that would be. And I fear we're looking at something similar here.
I couldn't agree more. The similar here is in some ways Bernie Sanders. In other ways, the kinds of people that he has inspired that we have not yet learned the names of, or we are learning slowly. Yeah, I didn't mean to disparage that effort. It was remarkable. If my understanding is correct, hundreds of thousands of young people joined the Labour Party out of the sheer excitement of exactly what you just said, as a new possibility. I see these as remarkable and very hopeful shoots, coming up out of the ground after a tough winter, that we're going to be seeing them in this country more and more. I think you're right, if I hear you correctly, that one has to wonder whether there'll be enough of them, if they'll survive the first few rough nights, to get enough of a footing, enough roots. Sorry about the mixed metaphors, but being able to sustain a growing movement. But I have to say, just to make it very personal, I'm doing more invited public speaking in the last 2 or 3 years than I did in the previous 50. And I haven't changed my tune all that much. What's happened is an awful lot of people who before found the tune irritating, annoying, or boring are suddenly decided that this is really interesting music. I mean, I'm thrilled, I'm happy, I'm grateful, but I think it's a testimony to the changes going on in the lived experience of Americans. And that's why I think that the symbolism there is so rich. The death of Queen Elizabeth, the longest reigning monarch, goes together with the end of Liz Truss as prime minister, the shortest time in office of any prime minister in the history of Britain, which is X centuries old, a government in total shambles, serious society considering bringing back the previous Boris Johnson, who lied his way out of office so egregiously that even the naughty boy image he had cultivated with such an effort couldn't save him. And a Britain that is busily pursuing the war in Iraq when it has a level of economic deprivation in its own ranks in the British Isles that are extraordinary. I mean, in many ways, the worst economic history in all of Europe or North America or Japan since the crash of 2008 has been in Britain. The working class there is completely decimated in terms of its economic reality and its future. That's what's the underlying abyss that the politics cannot paper over. And whether you have more conservatives, which is beyond belief, and remember, the party has now turned, the Conservative Party, after Boris Johnson, after Liz Truss, to a multi-millionaire of Indian descent who's been on the extreme right wing of that party. It's almost like there's a death wish amongst the political death wish amongst these folks. And when you look at who replaced Jeremy Corbyn, it is the most moderately, I mean, the word socialist could never be applied to Mr. Starmer, but he's barely a laborite. This is an eager centrist of the Biden Clinton variety, if you're going to draw any parallels. And the one thing you can be sure of, the level of problems Britain has are not going to be solved by Rishi,
Sunak, yeah.
Sunak. I mean, I'm trying to be as polite as I can, or Keith Starmer. These are people for whom the train has left the station and they're wondering, which way to run. It's really, we're looking at very extreme times of economic change and decay. And the failure of the sanctions against Russia, imposed by Britain and the United States leading the pack, should have been another sign. Something that we calculated is off here. What might that be? And yet you don't. You see denial, denial, denial.
And and by the way, another word that will never be applied to Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, is charismatic. But that's neither here nor there, I guess. But to what extent I keep wondering, I keep looking at Great Britain, and I've done this for some time now, as kind of the coming attractions, if you will, of the United States. I feel as if obviously there are, major differences of geography and everything else, but that in many ways Britain was the dominant global force, and it's managing the decline, and it's resisting the decline with nativism and, these types of things. But I wonder to what extent, a lot of people talk about the life cycles of empires and the kind of that certain patterns tend to repeat. And I wonder if we aren't, our system is extremely dysfunctional. Theirs is arguably even worse now. And, I know about the head of lettuce. Somebody had a head of lettuce in a freezer, which will last longer. And Liz Truss or the lettuce, and the lettuce one. And 0.03% of the population picked her because went to these very non-representative conservative party members. But I wonder to what extent we do see something of our own future and the future of the American empire in the British situation now.
Well, I think either we don't, either the denial is totally dominant, or else, and the or else frightening to me, frankly, there is the view that this time it will be different. And what that means is that this time, the place to which a dynamic growing capitalism has moved, namely China, India, and those places, that somehow the old from which capitalism has left, North America, Western Europe, Japan, are going to be able, by dint of massive economic punishment backed up by military war, is going to hold back the historical process that has repeated itself for many, many centuries. I'm afraid that most Americans, maybe aided by not knowing much history anyway, given the way we teach or don't that subject, are prepared to imagine that they're going to hold history back. They're going to prevent everything that happened in the last 40 years from continuing, that the Chinese either will lie down and roll over or somehow stop being the dynamic society that they are. I mean, it's just the confusion, the chaos in the very discussions of these issues, the enormous lapses. The discussion over the last 2 weeks, just for example, in which the Communist Party of China, a very large organization with millions of members, has a Congress and through its processes picks a leader. Processes, I'm sure, have some democratic elements and lots of absences of democracy all along the way. And the same process, as you point out, 0.03% of the
Right.
British people pick, and nobody thinks it's worth noting that an awful small percentage of the people are involved in deciding a leader in one place, and a comparably small, or maybe even smaller, in the other place. But one is an ally, and so we talk only about the drama of the personality, nothing about the implications of a non-democratic arrangement. I mean, this is a level of denial that reminds me of the worst moments of the Cold War. And I thought that one, at least, of the lessons of the Cold War had been that the dichotomy between good and bad was not a healthy response of either side to what was going on there. And it cost us innumerably, in innumerable ways.
And last question, I guess, but I've thought of writing a book called "Who Needs an Empire Anyway?" I mean, the part of this I don't understand is, and I genuinely don't, is okay. Let's say that China is the ascendant economic power. And we can threaten them militarily. We can budget $4 billion for military exercises in the South China Sea, as we're doing. We can do all these things. Or we can just say, fine, not completely fine, but in the sense that we can build a just, humane, prosperous society here in North America. We can trade with China. We can trade with other countries. We can. We're still rich in natural resources and so on. We don't really need to be the boss of everything. Why is that just a given in our political discussion that this is worth risking nuclear war for, spending phenomenal amounts of money for? Why not just say, well, I know somebody will call me an isolationist or whatever, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm just talking about, why don't we just accept that history ebbs and flows and let's build a decent society here? Is that a irrational question?
Not at all. And I would tell you, RJ, that you might be interested. There's an interesting institute in Cambridge, Massachusetts, called, I believe, the Abigail Adams Institute. Has some other names. I'm not sure of the bureaucratic arrangement, but they are carving out a place right there by Harvard University, advocating for pretty much what you say. They don't want the war in Iraq to continue. They want negotiations. The arguments they use are the very ones we are talking a little bit about here and suggesting are a better way to go about it. The conservative Republican Party, for other reasons, is also very dubious about this war in Iraq, wondering whether this is the way to manage.
In Ukraine, yeah.
Sorry, in Ukraine, to
Yeah.
manage a multi-polar world, to use the language they're enjoying. I think there are lots of American companies who have invested huge amounts of money in China over the last 40 years, often encouraged by the very government, the opening of China that Kissinger and Nixon achieved, and all of that. They don't want to see all that disappear. They don't want to forego all of the money. And they particularly don't want to be extricating themselves when they see their competitors from other parts of the world moving in
Right.
to replace the. This is not, and where? In the largest, fastest growing market on earth. You don't want to be a capitalist absent from that market, excluded from that. That's going to cost you in economies of scale and long-term competitiveness, all kinds of ways. And so there are people, this is troubling to the Bidens of our country. There are all kinds of corporate executives right now who are arguing for a completely different policy towards China. And they're not going to stop doing it. And they're not going to all quiet down. And they're not going to all shut up with saber rattling or with appeals to a kind of stale patriotism. They want to do what they're there to do, make profit, win the competition. In the long run, they're going to refer to the same history you and I are, saying history doesn't treat kindly those who thought they could escape global competition. It eventually caught up with them, and when it did, it was not a pretty sight, having warned themselves off. It's as if we don't understand that over the last 40 years, a large part of the prosperity of the United States was due to China. The profits that drove the stock market up here were profits made by companies who earned those profits because they underpaid Chinese workers or sold profitably into the Chinese market. Look, the Chinese have outproduced us already for decades. But what they lacked back in the 70s and 80s, as they were putting together the system that is now as efficient as it is, they couldn't distribute here in the United States. That they couldn't do. They could produce it, they could put it on a ship, they could bring it here. But how's it going to get into Boise, Idaho's department store to be sold? And then an American capitalist came up and said, I got a deal for you. My name is Walmart.
Right.
And if you run your stuff through me, I'll make you rich because I'll buy billions and billions, and you'll make me rich because I'm the one who's going to distribute the cheapest consumer goods Americans have ever seen. They're going to come to my store and drop everybody else, wipe out the little stores, the mom and pops in the country, but also allow American capitalists to get away with lower wage increases than they otherwise would have had to pay because their employees had access to going to the mall and buying cheap stuff at Walmart or Target or any of the others that joined in. The interdependence is very deep. You don't undo that in a short amount of time, and you don't undo that without consequences.
Right.
Nothing is going to be more supportive of a rising inflation than pulling the rug out from under cheap Chinese imports. Very, very, very stupid kind of myopic thinking, shifting with the fashions of this political wave or that one. Very, very dangerous. If Mr. Trump did dangerous things without thinking through the consequences, which his critics allege, Mr. Biden is meeting him step for step in doing exactly the same miscalculation.
And meanwhile, I'm thinking, okay, we lost them, what, a million and a half manufacturing jobs to China because the Republicans and Bill Clinton told us this was a good thing. Now you want to fight them? Now, now that our jobs are gone, this is when you decide. But unfortunately, I think I've kept you way too long. And I apologize for that. But as always, Richard Wolff, thank you for a very enlightening discussion, and thank you for coming on the Zero Hour.
You didn't keep me too long. Look, as I've told you, and I want to say it again, even at the risk of repeating myself, these kinds of conversation ought to be happening across the public space of the United States. our future, literally our children, our lives, our communities. That's what's at stake here. That's if you're watching the disintegration of social life in England, and that is what we are watching, then that is the foretaste of what we're going to be doing if we don't learn the lesson that they had to learn. It is go back to the ancient Greek Empire. Look up there on the hill outside of Athens, and you'll see the magnificent ruins, which is what is left. Greece today, that's what's left of the Greek Empire. And I don't mean to be critical, it's a beautiful city. Rome, London, Britain, US. Come on. If we want to be able to do better than that, the time to start is long ago. Well, we can't do that. So let's start now. And these conversations that you produce on your program are vital for all of this. I only wish there were 10 times more people that would be brought in to thinking and adding and contributing to what has to be said.
Well, thank you. We're working on that. So, Richard Wolff, again, thank you.
Thank you, RJ, and I look forward to our next one.
As do I. And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and you're listening to The Zero Hour.